So yeah, tonight, Politics and Prose has the pleasure of hosting David Enrich, finance editor at the New York Times. He previously was a reporter and editor at the Wall Street Journal in New York and London. Before that, he was the journal's European banking editor based in London and a journal reporter in New York. He has won numerous journalism awards, including the 2016 Gerald Loeb Award for feature writing. He is previously the author of The Spider Network, How a Math Genius and Gang of Scheming Bankers Pulled Off One of the Greatest Scams in History, which was shortlisted for the Financial Times Best Book of the Year. In his trenchant new book, Dark Towers, Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump, and an epic trail of destruction, David traces the bank's dark history, its relationship with the U.S. president, as well as the tragic case of William Broeksmit, to illustrate the evolution and character of an entity that has become a global face, the global face of financial malfeasance. I'll just let him jump in. Everyone, please join me in welcoming David Enrich to Politics and Prose.
Hello. Well, I have had the pleasure of doing lots of book events over the past few years for my previous book, and I've done book events like this with, I'm not kidding, 6 people in the room. And so this is just awesome, and I'm going to take out my phone and just take a picture because my wife will not believe this. And so maybe I'll take a couple pictures. So thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here, and it's extremely gratifying to see a turnout like this for a book about a European bank that no one's ever heard of. So I just wanted to, I guess for fiction or nonfiction audiences and nonfiction books, people generally do not read to start, but I want to read just the opening section of the book, which will just take a couple minutes just to set the scene, and then I will explain why I'm setting the scene and how I got into writing this book in the first place. It was a little before 1 p.m. when a wiry American emerged from the tube station into a drizzle, the type of dreary January weather that earns London its reputation as a depressing place during the long winter months. The man looked around Sloane Square. Normally, even in this dark season, the block was pretty and bustling with shoppers. This Sunday in early 2014, it was desolate. Val Broeksmit didn't feel well. He had woken up groggy from the previous night's drug-fueled jam session with his band. Then, on the crowded underground train on his way to Chelsea, he had been jolted by a surge of negative energy, like a dark spirit had brushed past him. He lit a cigarette and trudged toward the entrance to the Saatchi Gallery, his head down in a futile attempt to stay dry. He was scheduled to have brunch at the gallery's cafe with his parents. The last time he'd seen them was a month earlier, in December 2013, before they'd set off for the Caribbean and then a vacation in Oman. Val had just turned 38. While he was a talented musician with 34 albums to his name, none, alas, were chart toppers, he lived off the largesse of his father, Bill, who had spent many years as a senior executive at Deutsche Bank, one of the world's largest financial institutions. Tall, skinny, scraggly, his friends sometimes told him he resembled a tramp. Val was determined on this Sunday not to get an earful from his mother about looking like a slob. He wore slacks, a blue blazer, and a black woolen cap. At exactly 1 o'clock, Val arrived at the arched brick wall that snaked around the Saatchi Gallery. He was notorious in his family for never being on time, but here he was, and his obsessively punctual parents were nowhere to be seen. "Where are you guys?" he texted his mother, Alla. She didn't respond. Val wandered across the pedestrianized street, perusing a row of boutiques and overpriced shops. He came across the Taschen bookstore, which specialized in coffee table books about art and culture. For the past couple of years, Val had been collecting rare first editions. The older and more famous the author, the better. He was so into his hobby that he had done volunteer work for an organization that gathered unwanted books from estate sales and distributed them to needy children. Val would sift through the stacks, searching for hidden gems, and pilfer them for his own little library. The bookstore is mostly empty. Unlike this. Val browsed its shelves until something caught his eye. An enormous volume with a shimmering silver cover, priced at £650, about $1,000. It was a limited edition collection of Harry Benson's iconic photos of the Beatles, including the one of a pillow fight in a Paris hotel room. The book was signed by the photographer, and its pages were so luxuriously metallic that Val could see his reflection in them. He started to daydream about convincing his parents to buy it for him as a belated birthday gift. Val's iPhone buzzed, interrupting his reverie. The call was from a blocked number. Val answered it. A woman with a thick accent, Val was pretty sure it was his parents' housekeeper, Belle, was on the line. "Emergency, emergency," she shouted. Your father, your father." Val asked what she was talking about. He couldn't get a coherent answer. The only thing he could think was that he needed to get to his parents' flat, which was about a mile away in the posh Kensington neighborhood. He put the Beatles book down, raced outside, and hailed a black cab. 21 Evelyn Gardens, he instructed the driver. The 10-minute drive felt endless. The cab seemed to crawl through London's traffic-choked streets, past stately townhouses and brick apartment blocks, and high-end restaurants and organic grocery stores. Bundled locals hurried along the rain-slicked sidewalks, nearly keeping pace with the taxi. Val went through the possible scenes he might encounter when he arrived. Maybe his father was hurt? Maybe there was a big family argument? Or maybe it was just that Bill was locked out of his computer and needed his tech-savvy son's help. The taxi pulled onto Evelyn Gardens, a wide, quiet street that instead of having a median, allowed cars to park in the middle as well as on the sides. Now, in addition to the BMWs and Audis and mopeds, an ambulance was stationed at the curb. Val paid the cabbie and sprinted across the street. His parents lived in a flat on the third floor of a white-trimmed red brick building. Its heavy black door, normally opened via a buzzer, was ajar. Val galloped up 2 flights of stairs. The door to his parents' apartment was wide open. In the middle of the hallway, Bill Broeksmit was lying on his back, his eyes closed. A neck brace tilted his head back at an unnatural angle. A paramedic's plastic tube jutted from his mouth. Val's mother was curled in the fetal position on the dark wooden floor, her head resting on a pillow next to her husband's face. She was wailing. Belle kneeled beside her, stroking her hair. "What the F is this?" Val screamed. "He killed himself," his mother gasped. "He hung himself with Daisy's leash." So, that's obviously an upsetting way to start this talk and an upsetting way to start the book. 9 days, this was January 26th, 2014. And 9 days after that, I lived in London at the time and was a journalist working for the Wall Street Journal. And I got in touch with Val because I'd heard about Bill Broeksmit's suicide. He was a very senior executive at Deutsche Bank. And I wanted to learn more. There were rumors flying all over London that Broeksmit had committed suicide in part because he was upset about stuff that had been going on at the bank. He was extremely close to the bank's CEO at the time, a man named Anshu Jain. And I wanted to figure out what was going on. And Bill and his wife, Alla, had 3 children. Val was actually his stepson. And so I divvied up the task of contacting his widow and his family members with a couple of my colleagues. And I got Val. And Val had a very active social media presence at the time. He was in a band called Bikini Robot Army. And the band was active on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And Val was a character, I could tell right away. I mean, he was posting lots of pictures about doing wild and crazy stuff, lots of drugs, lots of kind of vaguely pornographic pictures of his exploits with women. And he was just kind of this completely inappropriate guy. And on his website, there was an email address, and I emailed him and introduced myself and said, I'm looking into your father's death, and I'm trying to understand more about what happened and why, and I'm hoping we can talk. And, I'd been a journalist at that point for, 14 years or so. And I've written lots of emails of that nature, made lots of phone calls of that nature. And I've been conditioned, like every other journalist, you almost never get a response in that situation. And it's usually a situation where you maybe send that initial email and you want to be respectful because it's a tragedy and obviously the family is grieving, but you also need to be persistent. And so that was kind of my opening salvo. And I expected over the coming days and weeks, I would be making additional phone calls, sending more emails, maybe showing up at his home. And lo and behold, the next day, Val responded to me. And he said, "What is it you want to know about my father?" And I explained that I'd heard rumors about what happened with his dad. And Val grudgingly agreed to get on the phone with me a few days later on the condition that my colleagues and I stop harassing the rest of his family, which seemed fair enough. And so a few days later, I got on the phone with Val, and this started a journey that has led to this book. Because Val, it turned out, had gotten onto his dad's computer very shortly after his death and had figured out the passwords to his personal email addresses, or his personal email accounts, his Yahoo and Gmail accounts. And inside of those accounts, he would eventually find his father had been sending and receiving thousands and thousands of emails and documents related to his work at the bank. And Val eventually turned them all over to me. And what it showed, Bill Broeksmit, it turned out, I started then doing a lot of research into who Bill Broeksmit was. And he and Val become kind of the protagonists, I guess you would say, of this book. And Bill Broeksmit he's American. He was a minister's son in the Illinois, kind of in rural Illinois. He became a banker, but he was kind of not your normal, reckless, aggressive, testosterone-y banker. He was much more cerebral, thoughtful, and intellectual. He was quite conservative. And he became known, but at first at Merrill Lynch, where he really got a start in the banking world, and then at Deutsche Bank as the man with the ethical compass, kind of the conscience of the place. And he was the guy who, this is an industry dominated by id. There's everyone wants to go, 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 step on the gas, shoot first, ask questions later. Bill was kind of the superego in most of these scenarios, where he would say, wait a second, this looks a little too easy to actually be right. Shouldn't we ask some more questions? And he was smart enough and respected enough that people listened to him. And so what happened at Deutsche Bank over the years it's kind of a parable for what happened in the banking industry writ large over a long period of time. The banks went from being these companies that essentially existed to serve their customers. And they became entities that, and not only their customers, actually, their customers, it was the communities in which they operated, it was their employees, it was governments, and of course it was their shareholders, the investors, their owners. And they went from kind of serving a whole wide range of constituencies like that to serving just one very narrow constituency, which was their shareholders. And that meant that their goal went from doing what's best for clients and communities to doing what's best for shareholders. And that meant maximizing profits as quickly as possible. And so as I got to know Bill Broeksmit through talking to his friends and family members and former colleagues, and then got to know him through reading his emails and seeing him in action, trying to curtail people's risk-taking and try and remember this fundamental question of, is this best for clients? And if not, why on earth are we doing it? It really was kind of quaint and old-fashioned. And I kept thinking about this, and we didn't really write very much about this at the time because this is 2014, 2015, and it's interesting. And Deutsche Bank was a really important financial institution and a really troubled financial institution at the time. But, I was working for an American newspaper, and this is a German bank, a European bank that, despite its grave problems and despite its big presence in the United States, no one really cared. And then, in 2016, a certain someone started running for president. And that certain someone had a very, very special relationship with Deutsche Bank. Donald Trump was completely off limits to the mainstream financial world because he had this nasty tendency of defaulting on virtually every loan he received for a very long period of time. And that's not, when banks are looking for customers to do business with, someone who has a well-documented pattern of stiffing his lenders is generally not your first point of call. And so he was just off limits. Banks would not touch him. They wouldn't return his phone calls. I heard some crazy stories about the great lengths that banks would go to avoid doing business with Donald Trump. Even his friends wouldn't touch him. And there's this one anecdote that I love telling people about because you can just kind of see it based on what we know about Trump these days. And so the story goes like this. It's at Bear Stearns, which was, I don't know if anyone remembers Bear Stearns. It used to be a Wall Street bank, and then it collapsed because it wasn't a very well-run Wall Street bank. So, and even Bear Stearns wouldn't touch Donald Trump. Bear Stearns knew the guy who's one of the top executives there, a guy named Ace Greenberg. And he used his relationship with Ace Greenberg to kind of get his foot in the door and proposed that Bear Stearns lend him, I think it was $100 million. And Ace Greenberg told one of the bankers there, okay, go deal with Donald Trump. He wants $100 million. And the banker talks to Donald Trump. It's not a crazy pitch that Trump's making, but it's Trump, so they're not going to lend him anything. And he says, okay, Donald, I'll call you back when we made a decision. And he just decides he's not going to call him back. And Trump is probably smart enough to get the message that the lack of a returned phone call means no, thank you. We will not be loaning you $100 million. Trump didn't get the message and kept calling the guy back over and over again. And the banker just didn't know how to say no, and so just wouldn't return his phone calls. Trump took Ace Greenberg, this guy's boss, or probably his boss's boss, out to breakfast one day and says, Ace, why can't I get my phone calls returned? It's so rude. And Ace comes stomping back in after breakfast and says to the banker, why are you not returning his phone calls? It's so rude. And the banker says, well, we can solve this problem by lending him $100 million. Otherwise, I don't know what you want me to do. And Ace says, well, we're obviously not doing that. But figure out a way to solve this problem. And so the banker thinks about it for a little bit and finally decides he's got a plan. So he calls back Donald Trump and he says, Donald, I'm so sorry. I've been dodging your phone calls. It's really rude, but I've got to say we can't make this loan. And Trump says, why can't you? And he says, well, Ace Greenberg doesn't want to. And Trump says, no, it gets better, trust me. And Ace Greenberg says, or Trump says, what are you talking about? Ace and I are buddies. In fact, just this morning I had breakfast with him. And the banker says, yes, Donald, and that's just the problem. Ace came back and said, there are 4 people we can't do business with, or we don't want to be on the other side of a loan from. Henry Kravis, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Donald Trump. And Trump pauses for a second and thinks about it and says, yeah, I can see that. That makes sense. And I heard that story and I just thought to myself, I sometimes discount the value that investment bankers provide and the solutions that they cook up. And I had to say, this gave me a whole new appreciation for the cleverness of some investment bankers. Anyway, Deutsche Bank did not have the scruples that Bear Stearns had when it came to deciding whom to lend to. And it was so eager to develop a foothold in America and develop a presence on Wall Street that it needed to kind of pick up the scraps that other banks wouldn't touch. And Donald Trump was one of those scraps. And so starting in the late 1990s, the bank started making what would turn out to be about $2 billion in loans to Trump over the next 20 years. And it was, by the time Trump was elected president, he still owed about $350 million. Deutsche Bank was by far his largest creditor. They had financed all of his marquee projects, including here in Washington, what used to be the old post office building and is now the Trump something hotel. So I started looking back at this relationship I developed with Val Broeksmit, everything I'd learned about his son, or everything I'd learned about his father and his father's career and kind of being a voice for probity and conservatism and risk management inside this reckless, out-of-control bank. And I realized that maybe this was the vehicle to tell the story of how this random, obscure German bank with a funny name that no one can pronounce and no one in America has heard of, how it became not only synonymous with financial destruction and economic doom and mayhem, but also really helped propel Donald Trump to the White House. And so I've spent the past 2 years or so reporting and writing about this for the New York Times. It primarily focused on the Trump relationship because I already kind of knew the Deutsche Bank story. And it has just been, I'm a nerd, and I had spent a lot of time, probably the past 10 years, focusing on and obsessing about Deutsche Bank and wondering why no one would pay attention. None of my editors kind of rolled their eyes when I started talking about it. And so it's just been such a pleasure to actually have a way to tell this story now in a way that, amazingly, people seem to care. So that's my thing, and I would be happy to answer questions. I'm sure people have a lot of questions about Trump, and I have lots of answers. So... And I was told to make sure people use microphones.
Okay. Sir, given your research on the origins and history of Deutsche Bank, is it your view that the bank's financing of Auschwitz, which I assume included its crematoriums, did they know of what they were doing?
Yes. Well, it's not quite that simple, but first of all, their work supporting the Nazis is much more extensive than just financing the construction of Auschwitz, which they did. They also financed the construction right next door to Auschwitz to a chemical factory that supplied the poison gas. Yeah, you guys know this. Deutsche Bank was the company that conducted many of what were known as Aryanizations of Jewish-owned businesses all over Europe as Germany conquered those countries. It took over the local banks and stopped lending and kind of helped get Jews out of the companies and off their customer ranks. It took the gold that the Nazis had taken out of the teeth and out of the jewelry boxes of Jews and others and sold it to provide the Nazis with hard currency. So this is, and in fairness to the bank, which sounds ridiculous given what I just said, this is what large German companies were doing in order to survive at the time. And so Deutsche Bank is not unique in having done something evil. It is clearly a party to genocide. And I think it's been easy for the bank, with the benefit of many decades having passed, to kind of sanitize that basic fact and explain it away. The reality is that we don't know for a fact that Deutsche Bank knew exactly what was happening inside Auschwitz, or what that gas was going to be used for, or whose gold it was that they were selling in Istanbul. I think we can kind of apply a just reasonable standard to this looking back. And how could they not have known? Come on. It was well known, I assume. One of the board members of the chemical company that was making the poison gas was basically the CEO of Deutsche Bank. So if he didn't know, I mean, how could he not have known? But I don't have proof of it. But I think it's safe to operate under the assumption that Deutsche Bank knew about this and did it anyway. And I think it's dangerous to make too many historical comparisons to something that is really incomparable in human history. But it is true that Deutsche Bank over and over again in its 150-year history, this is its 150th birthday, by the way. Happy birthday, Deutsche Bank. Over and over again, they have done the expedient thing and taken shortcuts in order to increase profits and sometimes to survive. And that has led them to commit many, many crimes. Obviously, partaking in genocide stands out as, I think, uniquely evil. But they've done a lot of bad stuff, and it generally is because they are rushing to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. Consequences be damned.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. That's probably more than you were looking for.
Hi, first of all, thank you for writing this book. I'm a financial regulator, and I think somebody's been needing to tell the story of DB for far too long. So thank you for.
You're welcome.
For putting.
Where are you a regulator?
Federal Reserve. I'd like to ask you a question about. I'm sure you're aware that Val, I can't pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to try to. I'm sure you're aware that Val. He's very active on social media, saying that you're not accurately portraying his version of events.
Yep.
And, his theory, or what he's saying, is generally that it's much more direct, the connections between Russian money laundering through Deutsche Bank to pay off Trump is the nuts and bolts of it.
Yep.
I haven't finished your books. I don't know if you go that deep into it, but he's pretty adamant that you do not touch on that, at least to the extent that he wishes that you did. Yep. And I was just hoping if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I was actually hoping someone would bring this up because I'm going to answer your question, I promise you, but I think let me just step back a little bit first. So Val and I go back about 6 years, and one of the things I'm good at as a journalist, it turns out I'm really good at working with sources, and I'm good at getting people who aren't supposed to talk, and I'm not very good at a lot of things, but that's one of the things I am good at. And so I've had a lot of relationships with complicated sources over my career as a journalist, and Val, far and away, no close competitors, is the hardest, most complicated, most intense source relationship I've ever had. And that's partly because I've known him for so long. It's partly because I've known him in the context of him having suffered this awful tragedy, which is his father's death. And it's also partly because Val is a complicated person. This is someone who was shoved into the foster care system at a very young age and was basically left there by his family, even though they were there and could have taken care of him. And he was left there from ages 5 to 9, so his formative years. It's someone who, subsequent to that, has had a lot of problems with substance abuse and addiction, and those are issues that he continues to deal with. So he is a troubled, complicated person whom I care about and whom I have a tremendous amount of respect for and sympathy for. Val and I are like not getting along that well right now, and we're not. And I'll be honest about that. And that's frankly kind of an understatement. Back in October, I wrote a story about Val for the New York Times that was kind of described the very complicated, very intense relationship that I just alluded to. And in that, I mentioned the fact that Val had a history of substance abuse. He had a history of credit card theft. And I noted that one of the things that was motivating Val as he tried to share his father's secret documents with media, including myself over the years, was that he really wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted to become kind of famous. He was trying to get a film deal. And I was actually just out in Val lives in LA now. And I was just out there visiting him last week for a podcast we're doing. And what I told him then is that I actually regret what I wrote, how the kind of the tone that I took at points in that article. I think it was accurate and I think honest from my perspective. And it was written in the first person, but it was a little too hard. And it was a little too mean. And I told him I'm sorry, and I am. So I say that all not to like just have you guys be my therapist, but because I think this provides context as to why Val's so angry. And so Val, after that article ran, which is I think early October, he's been kind of waging a war against me online, which is very tricky for me to deal with and completely uncharted territory. And one of the things he's been doing is talking to some other news outlets that are, and I say this with respect, but that are not the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or Reuters or the Associated Press or the Financial Times or CNN or PBS or NPR. Again, they're scrappy and they have different standards and they're run by younger people with less experience. And I say, seriously, I say it with respect. Some of the stuff that has been appearing that Val has been kind of out there spreading really oversimplifies things. There is not everyone who in business journalism who's been focusing on Deutsche Bank and Donald Trump has spent much of the past probably 5 years, certainly the past 4 years, searching for proof of this elusive rumor that Deutsche Bank, it's not really Deutsche Bank that's financially supporting Trump, it's Russia that is financially supporting Trump. And there's a tremendous amount of smoke there and tons of circumstantial evidence, and everyone is looking for the fire, and me more than anyone. And man, I wish I could stand here right now and say I found it, but I didn't. And neither did Val, and neither did the news outlets that he's been talking to. There's a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence. I think this book provides the most comprehensive and accurate description of what that circumstantial evidence is and what it means and how to interpret it. But if you're reading things like that this this Kremlin-linked bank called VTB was secretly financing Trump loans, that may be true, and that's the rumor we've all been chasing in the media for many years now. There's not proof of it, and Val doesn't have proof of it. I wish I did have proof of it, but I don't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I didn't get all the way through the book yet either, so I don't know. But there is a lot of news around Donald Trump's tax returns, and that the Deutsche Bank's been subpoenaed to produce them. And you would imagine if they've loaned him money, they have a lot of financial documents. So what is your take on whether they're going to produce them, whether they have them? They've implied they don't have them.
Yeah, this is another weird one where my reporting and my life has intersected oddly and kind of serendipitously with the news here. So first of all, just as background, there are a couple of congressional committees here, the House Financial Services Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, that are both conducting investigations that involve Deutsche Bank and its relationship with Donald Trump. And both of those committees have subpoenaed Deutsche Bank. This is, I guess, last spring, seeking basically everything they have on Donald Trump, which includes and not only Donald Trump, but his family and his companies as well. And so that includes his tax returns. It includes any kind of financial statements they have related to his businesses or himself. It includes any documentation about the loans or other services they provided. It includes documentation about any suspicious transactions that the bank detected involving Trump and Kushner's accounts. And so one of the things, as soon as I heard about this, I started talking to some of my sources who had been at the bank during the period when all these Trump loans were made. And a couple of my sources were actually involved in deciding whether to make the loans and in reviewing Trump's financial documents as part of the kind of due diligence process. And two of those people told me that not only did they have some of Trump's tax returns, they had, it wasn't the full tax return, it was the first several pages of, God, I can't even remember the form it is. It's been a long day. But going back from about 2011 to 2014, I think. And not only did they say they had them, these people had seen them. So, and they'd seen them in the bank's possession. And then in a court hearing in federal court, because Trump sued Deutsche Bank to prevent it from complying with these congressional subpoenas. So there's been all this legal wrangling going on.
Did he sue them to return them to him?
No, he sued them to just block them from complying. And so in a court hearing, Deutsche Bank's lawyers said, you know what? We do have some tax returns, but we don't have President Trump's personal tax returns. And this left me scratching my head because I had talked to people who had said they'd seen them. And so I actually texted one of these people, and I said, you're not going to believe what just happened in court. They said they don't have them. And he says, I mean, I'm not even going to say it because we've got cameras here, but there were some obscene words he used, and he said they're lying. I've seen them with my own eyes. I don't know if they destroyed them or returned them or what, but they definitely had them. So I've done some more reporting, and it sounds like they gave them back. And I don't know to Trump. And usually, I don't know exactly what happened in these circumstances, but usually what would happen is that a client has the right to request that his materials be returned. I don't know when that happened exactly. I mean, it was certainly in the past couple of years, but I don't know if that predates or postdates. I imagine it's before these subpoenas were issued, because I don't think even reckless criminal Deutsche Bank would do that after they had received a federal subpoena, but I don't know. Anyway, point being, it sounds like they do not have President Trump's personal tax returns. They do have some of the tax returns that were sought by these subpoenas, which includes his family members, or could include his family members and his companies. The tax returns, though, I have always thought are, like, I want to see them as much as anyone. And the New York Times has kind of led, not because of me, but because of my colleagues, has led the way in reporting on his taxes. But to a certain extent, it's a little bit of a red herring. I think the tax returns are, if they ever become public, are not going to show some of the most important things we want to know about Trump's finances. They're not going to show his sources of income. They're not going to show his business partners. They're not going to give a real view of which assets he has that are valuable, especially in countries that are outside the United States. The things that Deutsche Bank has that are much more valuable are going to be just his other financial statements, his income statements, any documents around it. And my understanding is that the bank has very detailed kind of like org charts almost that show the relationship between different Trump businesses that they have with each other, where all the money is coming from and going to. They've got the documents, or a lot of them. And they've also got documents that show some of the concerns that employees raised about suspicious transactions that went on in the Trump and Kushner accounts. And this is something that is not, I don't think, it's not gotten as much attention as I would have thought it would. But there are employees in Deutsche Bank's offices, compliance officers, who raised repeatedly red flags about what they deem to be suspicious transactions involving Trump and Kushner's accounts, including in the Kushner case of money going to Russians.
Yeah.
Where and their concerns were overruled, and it was never reported to the government. And in one case, the employee was fired after speaking out about it.
Wasn't there some money to Russians while he was in his inauguration or late stages
It
of
was
his campaign?
it was the Kushners the Kushner companies are in the summer of 2016, yeah, which is amazing.
Yeah,
and it's amazing to me. You know, banks always struggle with compliance issues, and they struggle with when and how to file what's known as a suspicious activity report with the government. Most banks err on the side of over-reporting these transactions rather than under-reporting them, and they over-report them to such an extent that it's actually a problem. It's like they flood the Treasury Department with these reports to such an extent that you can't make heads or tails of anything. Deutsche Bank just inexplicably decide to go in the opposite direction, which is holding back on these. And in particular, even when a couple of people raised a fuss about these Trump and Kushner transactions, they still didn't do it. So,
is there still a chance the subpoena will be? No,
yeah.
Yeah. They will.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there are oral arguments before the Supreme Court on March 31st, and a decision expected in June. And so it's entirely possible, I think, that the court will order Deutsche Bank to comply, which would mean they'd be handing over documents, Trump's financial documents, to congressional Democrats over the summer. And the story continues.
Hi. You mentioned that Bill Broeksmit was a banker with a conscience. Can you give any examples of when he urged Deutsche Bank not to do something, or maybe when he persuaded them not to follow a certain course?
This isn't entirely responsive to what you're saying, but the clearest example of his conscience, I think, or not even his conscience, his just good business sense in being a conservative businessman, was that he was on the oversight board of Deutsche Bank's main U.S. legal entity. It's an entity called Deutsche Bank Trust Company Americas, in case anyone was wondering. And this is the legal entity that, among other things, was doing the lending to Donald Trump. And this is an entity that has, at any given time, tens of billions of dollars of assets going through it. And it's an entity that has only a very few employees, including no chief financial officer, no real accounting staff. And Broeksmit raised a huge stink internally on the oversight board about why it was that this hugely important part of the bank that was under intense scrutiny from our friends at the Fed, and why on earth they didn't have a CFO? Why on earth were they seem to be shirking the some of what the Fed was asking them to do, including trying to conduct really aggressive, what are known as stress tests in the banking industry. And Broeksmit was one of the few people inside the bank, these emails showed, that was really pushing the bank to take more seriously what the Fed was asking and to just really clean up its act. And he did not succeed.
Okay.
Hi, looking forward to reading the book. Can you talk a little bit more about Justice Kennedy's son and what role he may have played in the approval of Trump's loans through Deutsche Bank?
Yes. Everyone really is interested in Justin Kennedy, which is Justice Kennedy's son. So Justin was at Deutsche Bank for about 10 years, from I think it was 98 or maybe 99 until 2009. And he was in what was called the commercial real estate business of the investment bank. So his job was to make big commercial real estate loans, like finance the construction of high rises and hotels and things like that, and then package those loans, cut them up into lots of pieces, package them into bonds, which then got sold to investors. And Kennedy's role was to basically handle kind of the second half of that process rather than the first half of the process. So he wasn't the one going out and saying, I will lend to you and you and you. He was saying, if we lend to you and you and you, this is how mechanically we will be able to kind of package it into bonds and sell it. And our expectation based on how we're going to sell it and structure it affects how much money we can afford to lend you and the interest rates at which we'll make this loan. So it sounds kind of technical and complicated, but it's actually in a lot of ways the most important part of the lending process. And Kennedy had a strong personal relationship with Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump as well. And he was one of the people who, on a number of loans, most notably, I think, they did a huge $640 million loan to Trump to build a huge skyscraper in Chicago. And Kennedy was one of the lead kind of point men on that transaction. And this turned out to be a really fateful loan for both Trump and for Deutsche Bank, because it was made in 2005, and 3 years later, the financial crisis happens, and Trump is having a lot of trouble selling the luxury condos that are in this building. And so he has to pay back the money, or he's supposed to pay back the money. And he asks Deutsche Bank for a 6-month extension, and they grant it. And the extension, it comes up in November of 2008, right as the financial crisis hits. And Trump doesn't have the money to repay, or doesn't have the desire to repay. And he takes this very unorthodox approach, which is, in addition to defaulting on the loan, he sues Deutsche Bank arguing that because the financial crisis was an act of God, it essentially voids the contract. And on top of that, I'm going to sue you because you caused the financial crisis, and I want $3 billion in damages. And so that led to a bunch of litigation. And, I've done a bunch of reporting around Kennedy's role in all of this. And Kennedy bumped into Trump. So Trump sues the bank. And the bank is like, you've got to be kidding me. This is not the first time he has done something really aggressive with Deutsche Bank and cost them a bunch of money. And so finally, the bank is like, we are done with this guy once and for all, seriously. And they're not, by the way. But that was kind of the temporary thinking. And that meant for Kennedy that one of his important clients was gone from the bank. And Kennedy bumped into Trump a short while after that lawsuit was filed. And Trump said something to the effect of, no hard feelings, I hope. And Kennedy, and Kennedy, thinking about his long-term future, was like, yeah, no problem. Business is business. Let's be pals still. And in fact, he was. He left Deutsche Bank at the end of 2009 and went on to strike up a very kind of long-term and very successful and lucrative business relationship with Trump and his children, and the Kushners as well, helping them do a bunch of other projects even after he had left Deutsche Bank. So anyway, I can't even remember exactly what your question was, but the relationship between Trump and Justin Kennedy was long and multifaceted. Anthony Kennedy would often come by Deutsche Bank's offices and talk to Kennedy and his colleagues and give people hugs. So he was a known presence in the Deutsche Bank offices. And I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but the book comes back to this at the end because Kennedy obviously leaves the Supreme Court. And without giving anything away, I will say that's not entirely unrelated to the work his son had done at the bank many years earlier.
What was the successor entity?
Excuse me?
Deutsche Bank, the successor. In other words, you said that Kennedy went to work or did his business.
So we have a line, yeah.
Hi. This is reminding me of a conversation I had with my husband 10 years ago, or one of Trump's sort of more high-profile bankruptcies, when I said that he and my husband and I were worth more than Donald Trump was at the time. So I'm really interested in following up a little bit on the conversation from the Federal Reserve gentleman here. What, if any, action have the German banking regulators or the European banking regulators taken against Deutsche Bank, given the recklessness, not just in this case with Trump, but in the rest of their business?
The American regulators who I spoke to for this book, a number of them described the German regulators using kind of similar phraseology, which was that they were the representatives of Deutsche Bank. And the main German bank regulator is an agency called BaFin, which is known for, it plays defense for its hometown companies. And Deutsche Bank is the biggest hometown company there is. It's a proud national institution. And American agencies and British agencies as well launch all sorts of criminal and civil investigations into the bank. Deutsche Bank would insist that those inquiries and requests for information didn't go straight to the bank or the bank's lawyers. They had to be routed through the local regulator, which is kind of technically the way it's supposed to work, but it's usually not really rigidly enforced. But Deutsche Bank would insist all of these requests for information would go through BaFin. And they would just die in this maze of German bureaucracy. And this happened over and over and over and over again. More recently, I think BaFin has kind of gotten the message that they need to be a little more serious. And there is now a new pan-Eurozone regulator that ostensibly regulates Deutsche Bank. But the U.S. and the British authorities have been much more aggressive. I will say, to our friend at the Fed, that the Fed, I don't think, comes across looking all that good in this book either. There are sorry. It's mostly your colleagues in New York, though. The Fed was aware of and had an opportunity to stop money laundering involving Russians with Deutsche Bank going back almost 15 years now. And on multiple occasions just took this very soft kind of slap on the wrist, we'll write you a written penalty and you better not do it again approach, which just, we now know didn't work. But even at the time, there's a scene in the book where Deutsche Bank gets their compliance people get kind of chewed out by Fed officials who are angry at them about laundering tens of millions of dollars for wealthy Russians. And they're expecting, based on the angry tone of these regulators, that they're going to get a penalty somewhere in the range of about $100 million. And instead, they get a penalty of 0. And they're just urged to please stop doing it, which has about the effect that you would think it would.
Can't resist the open mic here, I guess. But my question's maybe a little nerdy, I don't know. It's more one of clarification. You mentioned that over about 10 years or 20 years that Deutsche had lended Trump, and maybe the family more generally, but Trump, $2 billion, and that somehow he's been able to sort of whittle that debt down to $350 million. How much of the difference between those two figures can you sort of track in terms of profits from the businesses that were financed through those loans?
Profits for Trump or profits for Deutsche Bank?
Profits for Trump.
Well,
in other words, that he's the one that has to pay back, right? So,
yeah, I don't think Trump has. I don't think the loans haven't been really profitable for him. They've enabled him to do things that are very profitable, whether it's. And the loans from Deutsche Bank, one of the remarkable things about them is that Deutsche Bank was so desperate to do business with anyone it could, including Trump, that it was practically throwing money at him. Even after he defaulted, they were charging these ridiculously low interest rates that any of us with clean credit histories wouldn't in a million years get, like 2% on a $100 million loan, for example, which is, I mean, fabulous. So that, in a sense, is a hugely profitable transaction for Trump, because even though he's paying interest on the loan if he pays it back, it's still much cheaper than he'd be able to get anywhere else. And it allows him to go build things or buy things that are going to produce income at a rate much higher than 2%. And so it's very easy to pay back. But Trump, I mean, the funny thing about this is that Trump, despite his defaults and despite his record of not paying anyone back, for the most part, Deutsche Bank has emerged out of this pretty whole. And so it's not as if Deutsche Bank lost buckets of money on this relationship with Trump. And it was, first of all, charging him huge fees for all sorts of other services they were providing, whether that was managing his money or, and again, not to spoil stuff that's in the book, but playing kind of matchmaking services for him, where it introduced him to wealthy Russians who wanted to invest in Western real estate, including his resorts. But it was, the bank was, in the end, in the final accounting, I think, from a purely financial perspective, the relationship with Trump probably was profitable. And it's destroyed their reputation. But it's just in terms of the pure dollars and cents financial impact, I think it's probably been a good one.
Yeah, but the difference between the $2 billion and $350 million is,
so that's just a product.
It's unclear. What's the explanation for that, or is it clear?
Yeah, no, it's pretty clear. So those loans, first of all, date back to 1990. The $2 billion dates back. It starts in 1998 with a loan to gut renovate a building on Wall Street, and those loans got paid back over and over and over again. So the $350 million are I think it's 4 loans, maybe 5 loans that have been made since 2011. The others have been paid back either to Deutsche Bank or to other parties that had ended up lending it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, that was a simple question that I made very complicated.
Isn't there a lot of irony here that the Germans are supposed to be these prudent savers, and I've always felt this, and all of a sudden Deutsche Bank, which is their national bank, is loaning money this way to Trump and others. I mean, does this money come from those prudent German savers that's being loaned?
Well, Deutsche Bank is, most of the money it's lending is actually money that it's borrowed from big international investors through issuing debt or selling stock, things like that. So it's not the German savers who are subsidizing the Trump loans. But the real irony of that to me is that the whole reason Deutsche Bank felt it was necessary and important to get into doing the wild and crazy stuff it did on Wall Street and with characters like Trump is that it turns out that being the bank to a bunch of savers and people who don't really want to borrow money is not lucrative. And so the bank in the 80s and 90s was watching as its rivals in America and in London were just minting money on all sorts of crazy Wall Street activities and on people's just burning desire to get into debt. People and institutions burning desires to get into debt. And so Deutsche Bank, serving a primarily German clientele, the Germans did not want to go into debt. They'd been, they're scarred by their own historical legacies. And so Deutsche Bank was really trying to boost its profitability and attract international investors. And the way to do that was to make money by getting other people more in debt. And so it turned its sights toward really all over the world, but including in America, where it found people like Trump. And can I just also say, before I forget, this is completely unrelated to your question, but it's not just Trump that they were doing business with. I mean, Trump is obviously the most famous kind of marquee client they had, and obviously it's generating lots of headlines. But I mean, this is a bank that was so desperate to get in bed with anyone it could that it was really just open for business with the worst of American capitalism. And Jeffrey Epstein, I think, is the kind of clearest example of that. Jeffrey Epstein obviously kind of lied to everyone and said he was a billionaire and was this wonderful financier, blah, blah, blah. But by 2012, 2013, after he'd been convicted of sex crimes, people realized that he was kind of full of it and that he was, morally reprehensible. And so he started getting kicked out of his banks. And the final bank to kick him out was JP Morgan, which finally washed its hands of Epstein at the end of 2012, early 2013. And Epstein, who at this point was, had a lot of money that he had somehow from some people and was still trying to keep up this facade of being this international kind of businessman, didn't have anywhere to go. And he probably would have had to shut down his dirty little operation were it not for a certain bank that came and decided, even when every other bank had cut him off from the financial system, it was willing to get in bed with him. And that bank, you will not be surprised to hear, was Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank continued to do business with Epstein up until the time of his arrest last summer. And that was even after multiple employees in the compliance division and elsewhere in the bank raised concerns not only about the ethics and morality of doing someone who is not only a convicted sex criminal, but also was well known to be having done a lot more bad stuff than what he'd been criminally charged with. But it was also that they were seeing signs internally of him laundering money and possibly bribery and things like that. And yet the bank, once again, overruled those concerns and continued doing business with Epstein because it seemed lucrative to do so. Yeah, this is a bad bank.
Yeah, I was wondering, first, what is sort of the net worth of Deutsche Bank right now, and then what is roughly the total amount of fines and settlements they've had to pay associated with conduct related to the financial crisis?
Yeah. The first question, I don't know off the top of my head. The metric I have in my head is that its stock peaked in 1990 or in 2007. It was at the time the world's biggest bank. As of a couple of months ago, its market value had declined by 95% from that peak. It actually has gone up a little bit in the past couple of months because some investors are, I think, getting a little more confident that maybe they are going to focus on reforming themselves. They've been fined. I don't have the exact number on how much they've been fined either. It's well over $10 billion, which sounds like a ton, and it is a ton. It actually probably is not the bank that's received the biggest fines. This is an industry that has been fined a lot and has behaved very badly. And Deutsche Bank definitely has the distinction, I think, of being the world's most destructive bank. And I think that's in part just the pure destruction of money that and you can look at that in their market value declining by 95%, which is pretty impressive. But they've also basically every financial scandal over the past 10 or 15, maybe 20 years, Deutsche Bank has been either at or near the center of it, whether it's laundering money, bribing government officials, manipulating interest rates, manipulating currencies, evading taxes, violating sanctions. Have I said laundering money? Laundering money, deceiving its customers, ripping off governments. I can go on. It's a bad bank.
Did they clean house and get new management recently?
Yeah, they've cleaned house and had new management several times in the past 10 years. The guy who's running it now is a guy named Christian Sewing, who has been at Deutsche Bank for 30 years. He spent his whole life there. I've met him. He seems serious, and the bank is shrinking a lot and trying to turn over a new leaf. And Christian Sewing said, I think late last year, as he announced kind of the latest turnaround plan that they've presented to investors, that finally we've made a ton of mistakes over the past several decades. We're going back to our roots, and we're going to be a lot like the way we were back in the olden days. And I remember thinking when I read that like, he maybe needs to brush up a little bit on their history before he says things like that. So they have a long, tough road ahead, and it'll be interesting to see whether they survive.
So we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. I've really been enthralled by your information. My question to you is, it's obvious that Deutsche Bank played a very integral role in getting Donald Trump back on his feet financially, as you've alluded to and documented in your book so brilliantly. But Don Jr., as we've seen so many times on television, when he was asked quite a few years ago, well, how is it that your father got back on his feet financially if all the traditional banks kept turning him down? And he so foolishly said, oh, the Russians, we got our money from the Russians. So what fundamentally is the connection between the Russians, like probably VTR, and Deutsche Bank, which you can't get a clear picture on or a handle on, but there's obviously, it doesn't take a lot to connect the dots between VTR and Deutsche Bank.
It's VTB.
VTB.
It's actually the I think it was Eric Trump who made the comment about the Russians financing the golf courses, and it's even better than you said, because he said Donald Trump or the Russians have been financing our golf courses, and right at the time that he said that, they had just bought a new golf resort down in Miami called the Doral, and guess who paid for the financing of that? Deutsche Bank. And so he said publicly that it was the Russians who paid for it, but it was actually Deutsche Bank who paid for it. And so it's obviously very confusing in Eric Trump's mind whether it's the Russians or Deutsche Bank. So look, Deutsche Bank has been in Russia on and off for more than a century. It has extraordinarily close ties with Russian companies and with the Russian government. The bank's longtime CEO, Joe Ackerman, when he stepped down as a CEO, Vladimir Putin offered him a job in the Kremlin running the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And VTB, which is known as kind of the spy bank because it had offices all over the world, it was kind of an outpost for Russian intelligence, and it financed the KGB during the Cold War, and is now run by a close pal of Putin's. And VTB, the links with Deutsche Bank are so close. And the son of the CEO of VTB was running Deutsche Bank's Moscow operations for a long while until he died in a mysterious accident. VTB and Deutsche Bank and basically the entire team that started VTB's investment banking business was a crew that was hired directly from Deutsche Bank. The two banks have lent each other tens of millions of dollars in recent years, and it's not even tens of millions; it's hundreds of millions of dollars they have been lent, and so the ties are very tight. And it offers a very neat explanation for why Deutsche Bank would be willing to take such extraordinary and imprudent risks on lending to Trump. Maybe they weren't taking any risks. Maybe those loans were essentially guaranteed by VTB, which would mean in essence that it was VTB and therefore the Kremlin that was financing Donald Trump all these years, not Deutsche Bank. That is the delicious, entirely plausible rumor. And I and so many other journalists have spent, I in particular, honestly, because I've devoted the past several years of my life to digging into this. Like, I've been examining documents, I've been interviewing scores of people who were involved in this, and I don't know if it's true. I don't have proof. What I have is a lot of circumstantial evidence, and there is a lot of circumstantial evidence. And I wish I could say more.
What would be your speculation as to why VTB is so enthusiastic of financing Trump, obviously indirectly through Deutsche Bank?
Oh, can I say one other thing about VTB? Sorry, I just forgot. Felix Sater, who I don't know if anyone knows who Felix Sater. Yeah, we all know who Felix Sater is. Felix Sater, not that he's reliable, but he says that when Trump was planning to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, he says, and Sater was involved in this, he says that it was VTB that was handling all the travel arrangements for the Trumps, getting visas, things like that. So the connect, and again, Sater is not the most reliable witness on these things, but why would they be doing this? I don't know. I mean, it would essentially be the Kremlin doing it, and we know obviously that the Russian government was interfering in the 2016 election, trying to get Trump elected. And so it's not that hard to imagine why a government-owned bank would be trying to make Donald Trump's life a little easier and make him kind of a more, polish his record as a businessman. But again, like, I do not approve that is what happened. I don't even have, it's not even proof. It's like, there are a lot of rumors. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we would never publish that in the newspaper because it's not solid. Right. And I wish I had it, but I don't.
Yeah, it'd be strictly classified as maybe speculation at this point. But I guess my fundamental question to you is, what horse in the race do the Russians have through VTB and indirectly through Deutsche Bank of supporting Trump? What are they going to ultimately gain by it? What's their end game?
Well, look, their end game the Russian government's end game clearly was to get Trump elected. Maybe that wasn't even the end game. I mean, that was one of their goals, clearly, and that obviously was successful. I don't know that VTB was actually doing anything to support Trump financially or otherwise, though. All I know are these rumors. And so I don't want to speculate about why they might have wanted to do something that I'm not even sure they did. I know that's frustrating and unsatisfying, but